It's our very big pleasure to welcome you this morning to this interesting event. My name is Ferdinand Pavel. I'm leading the economic advisory work with EY here in Berlin. When I started to do this with EY was in 2016. At that time we had there were the first sort of shock waves from politics with serious effects on business. We had the Brexit discussion in the UK. The US president at that time, Donald Trump, imposed tariffs on steel products for reasons of national security. This all at that time was fairly new to us. Since then, we've come a very long way. We've seen a global pandemic. We've seen a horrible war. We still see a horrible war in Ukraine. And we are in the middle, or at the starting point actually, of a very significant transformation of industry towards decarbonization. We have in the European Union the Green Deal, with an attempt of an explicit attempt of policymakers to actually affect the way businesses are operating around the world. And then above all, of course, we have this increasing rivalry between China and the US, with tensions we just saw on the weekend, the very recent events where we still are puzzling about what that actually was about and what it will lead to. And so all these things together make it very clear that our topic today, geopolitics and how it's affecting businesses, that this is very timely to talk about it. So with this short perspective from our side, I'm very happy that we have the opportunity today to have a format with a panel discussion at the beginning, and then afterwards a workshop where we are talking about where we're having a bit in-depth discussions about the implications of all the topics that we raised in the discussion before. So we are excited to see how this is going. We're very curious to also hear your perspective, your opinion, and your take on all these issues. And I think with this few words, Dyria, I'm very happy to hand over to you. To United Europe, and we are all looking very much forward to this day.
Thank you very much, Ferdinand. A big round of applause. Thank you for hosting us today. Ferdinand said everything. Also a warm welcome from my side. It'll be a 1-hour discussion today with a Q&A session included, so you'll get the chance to weigh in on the conversation. And the panel discussion will be followed by workshops and a lunch. So now just a few words about United Europe. United Europe is a non-profit organization financed exclusively by membership fees and donations. We have we are a strong pro-European network with over 10 years experience of bringing policymakers together, business, thought leaders, and also young leaders from all across Europe. So we strongly believe that Europe does not only and should not only happen in the Brussels bubble, but even more so on personal encounters and exchanges. So with this, I would like to introduce the panel. And I would like to thank also Felix Klein, of course. He's been a tremendous support with my organization. And thank you, Felix. He will be co-moderating today also this discussion. With this, I would like to introduce the panel. We are very fortunate to have experts such as Dr. Josef Braml. She's from Agora. She's a partner at Agora Strategy. Then we have Dr. Josef Braml. He's the European Director at the Trilateral Commission and author of the book Transatlantic Illusion. Then we have Tim Rühlig. Dr. Tim Rühlig, he is a senior research fellow at the DGAP and authored the recent book China's Foreign Policy Contradictions. And Dr. Ferdinand Pavel will also join the panel. He's a director at Ernst & Young. And with this, I would say we'll take a seat and start with the discussion. So the title of our panel today is China, Supply Chain, Dependencies, and Europe's Foreign Policy Interests. Europe's economic future resilience depend very much on imports of critical rare earth metals, which are necessary for the green transition, for defense technologies, and also basically for an advanced economy. The main share of the world's rare earth metals are provided by a few countries only, with China having a quasi-monopolist position in the supply chain. The race for material supply became a key factor in recent geopolitical tensions. So I recently read, Jennifer, I would like to start with you. I recently read that in the next 3 decades, the world will need more rare earth metals than has been mined for over 1,700 years. I mean, this number is really staggering. It was a BBC headline. Can you put this into a geo-economic perspective and what it actually means for Europe, given that we're so vulnerable in light of our dependencies and the potential weaponization of these dependencies?
Thank you very much, Dyria. Yeah, as you said, we have a strong dependency at the moment for raw materials, especially of China, which is why China owns, most of all mines in Africa. A lot of mines in Africa where raw materials can be get from, and it's not only that China has a hand over these mines, but also the whole further processes of production are set in China, and to do this whole producing in Germany, and we don't have all these capacities set up at the moment because it's just too costly. And so one thing we should actually think about is in terms of being more independent of China in terms of, and also to secure our access to raw materials is really setting up own capacities for producing materials for the whole process of developing and also getting on securing also supply chains for raw materials in Europe, but also on seeing who other partners could be besides of China. So very much looking at a way to diversify our supply chains and for raw materials.
Absolutely, Tim. Do you have an opinion about how the EU is currently managing its capacities to diversify the supply chain?
Well, I think the EU is still sort of struggling to find out what precisely it wants. I mean, the truth is that we've come to a stage of a bit of intellectual laziness, I think. We've been struggling a bit with the whole idea that Europe could become geopolitical in the first place. That's not been in Europe's DNA, and that took quite a while. So then we sort of, what we have achieved is sort of some sort of acknowledgement that we need to do something, that we need to decrease our dependencies, strategic dependencies. We have sort of come to agree that we don't want to decouple, but that we need to, tackle issues that simply make us vulnerable, and that the goal is not to become self-reliant, but that the goal is ultimately to, maintain the freedom to act internationally. That's sort of as far as the consensus goes. And for this, if you go to Brussels, you find the label strategic autonomy. If you go to Berlin, it's rather sort of circling around anything related to sovereignty. But so you may use different terms, but that seems to be the consensus. But what people don't quite understand is that they mean very different things when they talk about this. So I think that can be about supply chain resilience. It can be about national security concerns. And when I say national security, I mean a sort of have a much thinner definition here than maybe the Americans have. Sort of if we think about sort of the digital domain, for example, this is mostly about intelligence gathering, backdoors, espionage, sabotage as well. So the concerns that we've been discussing a lot in context of the Huawei discussion. It could also thirdly be about values. Politicians in Europe talk about promotion or protection of universal values. One could also maybe factor sustainability into that. And fourth, technological competitiveness, and in some of the areas also export dependencies. And I think what we don't quite sort of really figure out, or where Europe got stuck, is that it uses terms that seems to be catch-all phrases that seem to cover all these different dimensions, while when you look at specific technologies, specific fields, specific sectors, you find that the challenges are quite different, and that the policy instruments that are actually there, that are available, are also quite different. It's quite different whether you want to become technologically competitive, or whether you want to have a resilient supply chain, or whether you want to close some loopholes in terms of your national security. And that is, I think, where we still got stuck. And sort of as long as we don't sort of acknowledge the complexity and the different layers of the concerns, I think Europe can hardly be sort of at the stage where it can effectively and targetedly face the challenge and meet it.
Absolutely. Ferdinand, do you have a perspective on what the dimensions are necessary of concerns are for the EU to manage the challenge of supply chain resilience?
Yeah, I think it's like Tim said, it is not really clear, or there's not a real understanding about what is actually the challenge, what is the situation we're currently in, and why suddenly we have this mess. I think we need to understand where we were coming from. This was like 20, 30 years of Washington consensus, rule-based global economy. With like in businesses, we talked about just-in-time global supply chains, efficiency above all, and this has led to a construction of a global economic system where everything is governed by like cost considerations and efficiency, and politics didn't really matter. And if you talk to business people now, and that's like I described at the beginning, I'm with EY for 7 years now, and one of the things that I thought is very easy at the beginning was when we have the discussion about the Brexit, I just need to talk to all the German firms who have supply chains also in the UK, and that's going to be very, very good business, because they all need to do something. What I found out is they all said, "Nah, this is politics." They will talk a lot, and at the end we find an easy solution. After all, like economics prevails, and cost efficiency is everything. And this is a kind of mindset that is still there, and it's still very present. And now suddenly we have much stronger pressure points. People have seen that in the UK they do it the way they want to do it, and they do it the way the politics decides and people decide, and not the businesses. And we will have the same also upcoming with a relationship with China, or Europe in the middle between this rivalry, US and China. And we need to be clear what actually is it that we want. And to be honest, I don't have the perfect answer. I'm an economist, so I really like the world that I described, the global efficient supply chains. This is what we call the first best outcome, and we all have to see that first best is something we cannot achieve, and we need to understand how should our second best look like. And what I think, as for now, I think the most important thing is resilience, like being independent of, or being prepared for whatever happens. And this is what I would say is how we should see the rivalry to China, and how we should see the geopolitical challenges overall. And we have a strategic goal, which is the decarbonization of our industries, and we want to maintain competitiveness of the European industries in this process, and doing it in a way that we are resilient to whatever happens. I think this is how we should handle it.
Absolutely, and I will come back to the decarbonization. But first, Josef, are we resilient? Is Europe resilient to the challenges we're facing?
I think resilience is a smaller problem we have not strategically thought for the last decades, because we were the junior partner of the United States of America. They did what was in our interest, and so I come back, before I come to the very specific, I start as you did, Ferdinand, from the broader perspective. Why are we in that mess? I mean, we have to ask why in order to understand whether we want that or not. So the basic question is, in what world order do we want to live in, and which world order are we living in? We wouldn't have that problem if the United States would still be the benign sole hegemon, a unipolar moment. Washington thought everybody else is playing according to its rules. That was the idea. China would be a responsible stakeholder playing according to the tune by Washington. Well, that was a mistake, some say now. Some say even bringing in China to turn down the Soviet Union at that time was a huge mistake. So they are challenging everything, because the idea was, there's no doubt we will rule the world forever. But now China is not a responsible stakeholder. We tried at DGRP, where I used to work 3 years ago, to try to mend fences to prevent the decoupling, as we saw it coming already there. And the Chinese were very self-confident, and they said, did you ever think we would sit at your casino? you kind of faked and play according to your rules? No, we never thought of doing that. So, and people who have been warning American elites, the Chinese are, a proud civilization. They have been there before we even thought about things, and there's just a century of humiliation. They now catch up. They will never ever do that. Now they woke up, and now it's not cooperation any longer. So the basic question is, what world do we want to live in? Is it a world of cooperation, where we come from? That's when you can be efficient, this and that, or is it confrontation? And here you have to understand, what kind of national interest do you have? Is it a zero-sum logic? I win, you lose. Donald Trump, he didn't invent it. I mean, the Chinese say win-win, but they probably want to screw us twice. So maybe you can explain a little bit about that. Or is it a positive sum thinking? We all are in the better. So when we later come to environment, I think we have to learn to cooperate. Because while we are decoupling and doing this and that, we forget that this planet is on a hot mode. So there needs to be a modicum of cooperation. But the problem is, we run into the same problem we had maybe even before the First World War, when rising power, Germany, challenged the existing, let me finish that, because that's a really important point to get it home, because we are getting into the nitty-gritty, and one should worry about the nitty-gritties when you see the full picture. Though the point I'm trying to make is, if we continue with decoupling and we can camouflage it as resilience, we will end up in World War III. Okay? Is that a clear statement? I mean, what we are right now doing is laying the ground for another war. I mean, we have been thinking interdependencies is peace, is eternal peace with Kant. Russia proved us differently. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathtub, because we will end up with the other extreme. So somewhere in the middle, before we go into the very details.
We will come to that. We just wanted to also talk about other things in this conversation. So I want to come back to the decarbonization and the challenges we have to transform our economy for renewable and for decarbonization. So we see currently a big paradox in the current energy context. These should be simply magnificent times for renewable, for instance, for the wind industry. But in the middle of an energy crisis, clean and mature renewable technologies, they still struggle to make a profitable business. And all the big manufacturing giants like Siemens or Vestas, Ørsted, they're all flagging difficulties ahead. I want to know what might be the reason for that, because surely Europe should put the market into condition that these industry should flourish. What is the reason for them to be worried and to flag difficulties? Jennifer, maybe you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, again, when we think about renewable energy, especially you mentioned wind energy, solar energy. So we also know that already 70% of producing like the capacities or also what you need to produce in the end, wind energy and solar energy comes already from China, or is produced in China. So this is one difficulty. And again, also when you think about hydrogen and water energy, there's also already 50% of what you actually need in terms of material produced in China. So there's a new dependency coming up. And when we think about the big power rivalries, which were already mentioned between the US and China, we also need to find our position in Europe, where we're actually standing. So which are our future partners? Is it rather Western countries like European Union, European countries, the US? Is it China? Is it other Asian countries? And we really, also in terms of renewable energies, we really need to diversify. And what does diversification mean? If you're not thinking about decoupling, which would mean that we are taking all of the production sites out of China, especially from a German standpoint, because we are already too dependent on China. But it means that we can have a rather look at other countries which we already have trade agreements with, and which can also be future suppliers for the materials we already also need to produce renewable energy. If you look at the Asian market, that would be, for example, Japan, South Korea, but also Singapore, Indonesia, or countries and cooperating governments with which we are discussing about trade agreements like Mexico, Mercosur, of course, Chile, and then Canada, since we just were in the ratification process of CETA. So of course Canada will play a major role in renewable energies as well. So we really need to see where our future partners are. And then of course, when we think about renewables, there's still a great competition in terms of pricing with common energy supply systems. And also when you think about the supply system and how will you actually bring the renewable energies to the households and so on. So we also need to think about infrastructure projects. So we really need higher investments in that sense, and also in research and development. So we definitely need a much stronger cooperation in the European Union between governments, academia, and businesses to drive this forward.
Absolutely. So public-private partnerships is a very important point. Ferdinand, do you have an opinion to that? How could we create conditions in the market for these renewables to flourish and actually to take up, given where we are with the dependencies on China, especially in the renewables?
Yeah, I'd say we have also another issue that we need to seriously consider, and this is a bit like Josef mentioned. If we all prepare for or like laying the ground for the future war, for future confrontations. If you ask Siemens and Vestas and so about what market they are currently very exciting, I think they would all say the US, and not because of the natural conditions, but because of the new regulation. And the word is, of course, of the Inflation Reduction Act and the proposal of the Biden administration to subsidize renewable energies in a significant way that hasn't been there before. This will, for some industries, hydrogen, for example, if you manage to set up a production facility in the way that you get the maximum tax credits, then you will get a compensation of around $3 per kilo of hydrogen, which is roughly in 5 to 10 years the cost of production. So that is going to be a very, very profitable game changer and a very, very, very challenging new moment. This comes together with the requirements to actually have most of the technology and the equipment manufactured in the US. And so I would say what we will see in the next decade is the starting point of a new industry in the US and like an alternative to China. What does it mean for Europe? I mean, on the one hand, European firms will go there and try to receive as much of the benefits as possible, which will be possible, but they will need to go to the US and they will need to have their operations over there. So it will be lost added value here. What it will mean for Germany is it's again this second best logic. It's not the right way to actually do it if everybody is just looking for own benefit. But we have to see that's what it is. And in the US, it's not going to go away. This is going to stay. So what can we do from a European perspective? I think the only meaningful way forward is to set up something similar. There is a lot of discussion and there is a lot of also concerns about state aid because actually the only member states in the EU who are able to afford this is Germany and France. And if these state aid rules will be released or will be relaxed, then actually it'll be mainly Germany and France who start and could utilize these new opportunities.
So you mean like an Inflation Reduction Act just for Germany as well?
Something similar. I mean, what the Inflation Reduction Act is in practice is a very simple and easy way to set an incentive for an investor. A tax credit is something that is established, people know how to handle it, administration knows how to handle it, the rules are clear, and so you can make up your plans based on that. In Europe, we have a lot of discussion about an instrument called climate contracts for difference. That's a complicated word, and the instrument is at least as complicated. Nobody knows what to expect. In practice, they're telling that it takes about 2 to 3 years to set up state aid rules for this kind of instrument. There are some first movements here, some first attempts to set this up, but not in the scale that is actually needed. And we will not be able to succeed if we continue developing complicated instruments that are nice for economists and for theorists, but that don't work in practice. We need something very simple and similar to what the US has, and this is a tax incentive.
Tim, I would like to ask you, we're seeing between China and the US a little bit of a tit for tat. We had the CHIPS Act and now we have a solar ban where China is banning export on solar wafers, which would help also to maintain its dominance in solar manufacturing. So we are seeing every single piece of the solar supply chain today is largely dominated by Chinese manufacturers. They manufacture at least 95% of each component. And to be clear, I guess solar would not be the world's most affordable energy today if it hadn't been for the industrial scale-up China has put into it. So are we already in the midst of as with this tit for tat, are we already in the midst of an economic warfare or kind of Cold War with China?
Probably yes, but I'm not sure it's always that black and white. Also picking up a couple of things that have been said on the panel and connecting that to your question. I think that a major war, the Third World War, that has been described as a horror scenario, is certainly possible. This is concerning enough. Is it likely? I don't think so. I think the good news is that I do quite see the Chinese leadership, at least until this point, as quite rational. The question is, do we understand China's rationality always? And I think you say we are in a game of tit for tat. We are to some extent, but isn't it rather remarkable that China has reacted in a quite constrained manner to the October surprise controls in the semiconductor industry? I think we could have all imagined much more, not least in the field of raw materials. And we haven't seen it. Why is that? Some say China doesn't have anything at its disposal. I don't think so. At a certain economic cost, of course, China would have a lot at its disposal to actually hit back at the US. Others say this is because they fear if they hit back, we are actually exactly entering this tit-for-tat game, so there would be more to come from the United States, and we would get into a spiral that is also against China's interests. That might be correct, but again, isn't that a quite rational choice to say, well, I'm the one who's not sort of leashing out and not going to take the next step and trying to prevent the spiral. And that all points to the fact not that the Chinese are the better party in this geopolitical game, but that the Chinese have their own rationality that is also very much concerned sort of with what is happening domestically, in what sort of situation it is, economically. Specifically, I mean, China is in the middle of an economic transformation. And everyone who keeps saying that we have seen that Putin has prioritized his nationalist chauvinist project over potential economic gains when he invaded Ukraine may or may not understand Putin's rationality, right? But I don't quite see how this is proof that China is going to do anything similar. That said, of course, China has a nationalist chauvinist agenda. Of course, there is a risk of such a war, but I don't think that we should dismiss that China is acting quite rationally, and at least to this point. What is the challenge for us, I think, is that this rationality is mostly driven by domestic considerations. So we have quite little actually to intervene into this rationality, and if that boils down to issues like Taiwan, and I think this is quite challenging sort of for us to think how we can impact that.
Absolutely. And do you think that China is already mirroring the European and American debates over decoupling and strategic autonomy?
I see quite difference. I think the difference between the United States and the EU is still quite stark. So the question is, what is China mirroring? I think China is certainly sort of picking up the idea of making itself less reliant on us meaning the West, and any potential adversary. The dual circulation policy is sort of the euphemism, if you like. I mean, Xi Jinping sort of telling to whatever audience what they would like to hear. In the international audience, he keeps saying, well, there is this international circle rule, so we'll continue with opening up. We are ready to cooperate, etc., to whomever he wants to send this message. And then domestically, of course, the core element of it is sort of the domestic circle. I mean, after all, this policy is to strengthen domestic consumption, domestic self-reliance wherever possible. Ultimately, I think what the Chinese have understood, and something that we hopefully are on our way of understanding, is that this will remain an interdependent game. I mean, it is quite unrealistic to if we are willing to pay enormous economic prices, and sort of a war over Taiwan would certainly be such a scenario, then of course we would talk completely differently here. But for the time being, I think the likeliest is that we are going to play in a game of interdependence. And the question is, how can we sort of manage interdependence in a way that favors us both economically, having as much cooperation as possible, be as efficient as possible, but at the same time sort of striking a balance in still making us as resilient to external shocks. But frankly, it's not just the efficiency aspect that still speaks in favor of cooperation. To the extent that we decouple from China, that China is, that sort of we decouple into two different spheres, also prices of any potential confrontation decrease. And this is, I think, what has been said sort of earlier with regard to the danger of a third world war. So I mean, it's neither feasible nor is it desirable at this point to completely decouple. The question is sort of how to strike a balance, and that is quite challenging. And frankly, I don't think there's sort of this one formula to square the circle. The point here is, I think we really need to understand different strategic technological ecosystems and sort of understand what precisely is the challenge, different dimensions that I've referred to in my introductory answer to your first question, and then sort of see what are the right policy tools to tackle specific issues in specific strategic sectors.
Mm. And besides all that cooperation, we definitely also see a big component, which is competition between China and the US, and then us being some sort in the middle of this. And I always say there are two ways to win a race. Either you run faster than your competition or than your opponent, or you kind of manage to hold your opponent down. And I think we kind of entered that second phase of it, that it's no longer about the US running faster than China, but maybe also to slow China down a little bit. And I think the Semiconductor or the CHIPS Act is a big shift also in US policy here. Do you think, Josef, do you think that this would hurt China in the long run? And how effective will it be in the long run, and what effects or what impact will it have on us? Because we are very much relying also on Chinese economic growth. Our economy is very much entangled, as we just heard also from Ferdinand, with the Chinese economy.
We have to understand what that means. I mean, we have different scenarios. We had Kumbaya indeed, so the whole world would become democratic and only values. That's passé. The other, there's no probability right now. We may end up in a hot war. But what we are in right now, and that's bad as it is a Cold War. Mm-hmm. So decoupling means two different ecosystems and this and that. And think about the global south, who have been raised with all that globalization and this and that. So that's the thing. And what you just mentioned is just a declaration of Cold War, if not hot war, when you think about Taiwan and CHIPS. So the CHIPS Act is a lot more complicated, also for us in the longer run, than the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually pushes inflation when you think it through. So when you make a declaration of war to China, you won't be able to get the high-end chips, this and that. And then you say, well, I want the race, but you have to be miles ahead of us. It used to be America wanted to be 2 generations ahead of it. Now Blinken declared, no, we want to keep you down. And that has been the Chinese fear all the time. They said, you want to prevent us from growing. No, that's not the case. Now America put the chips on the table. They said, okay, this is now zero sum. We want to go up and we want to keep you down. And China, now is the big question. How do they react? They don't get the modern chips. They don't have the capacities to produce them. There is a big producer in the Netherlands actually preparing a trilateral meeting, 3 chairs together in India, and we get Peter Wenning, the head of that company, and they are pressured by America. You do not do business with China, otherwise you get in trouble with us. We weaponize the dollar. That's a war, and we are in that. And now we have to decide, and that's what Jennifer alluded to, do we want to be a known stable pillar, or do we want to be a junior partner here or there? And I think we have to be really clear about that. This CHIPS Act could also lead to China catching up. I'm writing a book right now with the former head of foresight at the CIA and National Intelligence Council. He has been traveling China for a long time. And there are people in the Chinese establishment who said, well, we are actually welcome that, because this forces us to not be dependent on Western technology. We have our own ecosystems. They have students, they are a lot smarter than our students in the STEM areas, even than Americans. So can we be sure China doesn't catch up on the chip sector? Think about the nuclear bomb at that time. The Americans were astonished, the Chinese caught up so fast. And this could happen again. So I'm trying to answer your question, but if you want to hear more, we are still at the panels later.
And I just wanted to know what's the impact on the European economy here.
We have to get
Or
out of...
maybe-
What?
Do you want to take that question, or you
I could.
both of us? Yeah, okay.
Or what, I mean, maybe those guys who have to leave later on. I mean, I'm here all day, so I can bore you all day afternoon. So those who have to go, maybe you give it a first shot.
Okay, so I'll try and then I hand over to you. So what are the implications for European economy? Of course, when you think about diversification, it will be cost intensive, of course. And also, I mean, we've been talking about decoupling, but we all know that, especially for Germany, decoupling is actually something which is not realistic because we are so dependent on China, and nowadays, especially in the automotive industry, the chemicals sector, and also we've been talking about raw materials and others. And when it comes to chips. So also here, we are very, very much dependent on Taiwan at the moment. And getting back to what you just said about the conflict between China and Taiwan. So President Xi, he made it very clear that also a military intervention in Taiwan is one opportunity. And we should take that very serious. And he's been talking about the year of 2027. 2027. So this is also something he linked his presidency to. So
and an American general
yeah.
said yesterday 25, so in 2 years from now.
So this is what we also know from American intelligence.
Much about Kumbaya.
So we will have a time frame from about 2 years to react to that. And what the US did is also with the Inflation Reduction Act, aiming at setting up a whole supply chain within the United States for chips, not to be dependent anymore from Taiwan. But still, this is another question in Europe. So we really need to think about setting up own domestic production capacities, which will be cost intensive. We will definitely need more R&D, and we will need more innovation and also investments in that sector. But thinking in long terms, this is really what we actually should do, because otherwise we will also face secondary sanctions, so to say. So come back to your question of how will the European industry will be hit by these geopolitical power rivalry. And this is what Josef just said. So we really need to think about working together with American partners or with Chinese partners. And it might be that if we continue working with Chinese partners, we will hit by secondary sanctions by the US and vice versa.
Absolutely. the question is, will we have the choice, or do we have to go either or?
Yeah.
So
the earlier we take our own businesses and innovations in place, the better it is.
I mean, the thing is, we are a small country, and so we as Germany don't want to decouple, because that would be a very poor picture. We have the European Union and the single market, which is a bit bigger than the German internal market, but it's still not it's not the pathway for growth and self-reliance. So also Europe needs to be integrated in a global system. And this global system, I mean, has a strong partner also in economics, but as well as in security and other things, of course, with the US. And that's a very valuable partnership, and something, when it really comes down to the important moments, then this is where we should go to. But we are far from there. And there's a lot of other places in the world, and there's also China. I think it's a bit similar to what Tim said. I'm not as deep an expert into China. I know some fragments, but if you look, for example, at the industrial policy they are pursuing, this is not actually or my impression as an economist when I read this is more like this is the result of serious thinking. They are aware of their demographic problems that they're having, and they know that they cannot be factory China for the rest of history. They need to have something else, and so they focus on innovation. They focus on pushing things, bringing things forward. They have done, like you mentioned, the example of in the solar industry. The same as like in Germany, people are still saying that they stole our ICE and they can only do copies. In reality, what they have also done is to develop a track system where a train like the ICE can actually go as fast as it can. Not like we have in Germany. Yeah. And then what I also found very interesting is how China reacted on this struggle with Huawei. Huawei was put in the US on a list where a sanction list where usually you have like companies producing weapons and like seriously dangerous stuff. Like Huawei is producing communication equipment. This was already a strange movement, and the reaction of China was twofold. First, they introduced similar laws, but they never really used them against the US. But rather what they did is to say, we focus on development of the next standard of mobile communication. So they developed a strategic approach towards establishing the 6G communication standards. And so all this is clever, and is not. I mean, it's of course in their interest, but it's not. It's not like an act of Cold War. It's clever and strategic economic conduct, and I think that's a sign that we're not in an automatic process where at the end we will have this war. But it's something that there's still good reason to say there is possibility to cooperate with China.
And I want to put my finger on the wound. I mean, do you think that we or Europe can find its own China strategy, or not? Just a quick observation or perspective from your point of view.
Well, Europe is certainly not doomed to follow the United States, if that's the question on anything related to China. Europe will never be in an equidistance between the United States and China. So obviously we are going to coordinate with like-minded partners, including in the United States. But I don't see that we are sort of in full alignment with the United States on our perspective on China, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. The United States will be demanding certain policies from us, certain steps from us. We will, in some cases, I guess, give in and sort of compromise there with the states. I don't see us fully aligned. What I'm sort of interested more is sort of how united are we Europeans on China, and also how, and a second may even be more important in that context, sort of how high is our European solidarity, and that sort of circles back to something Ferdinand has mentioned earlier, sort of how to reply to what is the European response to the IRA or anything similar that may come in the future from either China or the United States. And I think given the fact that a country like Germany, but also France, also others, are too small in themselves, the only way is actually to go more European, and that will, given the circumstances that we live in, given sort of the sizes of different economies, require steps and compromises also from our side, thinking here, of course, about also common debt. So stuff that we Germans certainly don't like to hear, but I mean, in the end, one issue whether we Europeans will prevail is whether we become more European, whether we do stand more together or not. That to me is at least as decisive in that struggle with the US and China.
Absolutely, and this brings me right to my next question, because we see that the Western bloc, in brackets, is already a little bit divided, or the European bloc, because we see China establishing very strong relationship to some European countries like Portugal, Hungary, and Greece, and not also to forget the recent investment in the Hamburger Hafen, and then Olaf Scholz's visit in November to China. How should we define our European answer to kind of wrap it up and to come to a conclusionary statement?
10 seconds?
10 seconds.
Yeah. We have to create the United States of Europe, and that only works with common debt. We have 750 billion to fight Corona, to be more digital, to be more green, to be more feminist. But we need a lot more, also to reconstruct Ukraine, and also to do what we have said, sovereignty. I mean, sovereignty is a nice word for not doing anything. So only if you have a lot of money, you do not go France against Germany, Germany against Italy and others, to split it apart, because that's what China and US want. They do divide and conquer. If we want to stay together, we have to do probably industrial policy as the Chinese do, as America is copying right now the Chinese. They're out-Chinesing the Chinese. We have to do ourselves something. And so what means industrial policy? Lots of money. I would say not on specific tools. I would here say the market is better than bureaucrats in Brussels. I would push for research. I would push for education. It takes 15 years, that's what Wolfgang Reitzle said this summer in Switzerland, to build up the whole infrastructure you need for higher-end chips. 15 years, because we have been dozing off. We are not really there. The Americans are not there either. They take what they can get from Taiwan, bring it to America, even the minds and everything, I mean the brains. We cannot do that. We have to now start preparing for this new Cold War we are already in, and hopefully it's not getting a hot war. This way or that way, all the scenarios, a united Europe would be the answer. That was the advertising block.
Yes.
She let me speak longer when I do advertising.
So we really need to speak with one voice in the European Union market to be relevant and to be heard on the global market in the future. And that is also to decrease our vulnerability to supply disruptions, and also the price vulnerability, which comes if we do not diversify in global markets. We really need to foster innovation and research and development. We need more collaboration between governments, businesses and academia. And we really, what you just said before, really need to set up not only a strategy on China, but also a strategy on how we see Europe's future in terms of politics, but also businesses in the future. Also when it comes to renewable energies, and to think in a even much more sustainable way of production and raising businesses.
Yeah, I would say join forces, develop a position of strength. This requires money, fully aligned with what Josef said.
And the other one is if the Chinese are reaching out to Greece or to some other countries, this is not an act of evil activity or so. This is, from their end, a clever strategic thinking. One needs to realize it and then offer something better, and don't be afraid. That's my answer.
I mean, to the extent that I'm a supporter of the United States of Europe, I'm also not sure how realistic it is sort of in the short term. So let me sort of focus sort of on the second best scenario or the third best scenario or something. So you've mentioned a couple of states that may have different approaches to China. I think that we need to still differentiate. I think that Hungary is the only one that is sort of openly sort of sympathetic to any sort of more Chinese-style autocracy. If we speak about Portugal or Greece, I think the story is quite different. There are dependencies on China. They do sort of value certain aspects of doing business with China, but I think there's sort of a less deep sympathy for it. In the end, this may sort of speak against the idea of a united Europe, but I think the only realistic way forward in the short term is to find a group within the EU of like-minded states to much more closely align on China and sort of agree that sort of the principle of consensus will not apply to foreign and security affairs within that smaller group. That is, of course, always open for others to join, but sort of I think it's the Europe of two speeds. You need to get forward, otherwise we're going to wait for the final member states until the end of our days, I think, and by that time Europe will have probably lost sort of its significance in the geopolitical game.
Absolutely. And with this, I would like to open the floor. Yeah, we end on a very happy note. No, but I would like to open the floor for questions. So anyone who wants to come forward and ask our panelists. Please.
I have a question in terms of policy, in terms of countering the influence of China. Have you guys, or what are the thoughts on actually collaborating with more regional actors, let's say with regions like, let's say, Australia or New Zealand, and that's coming from it because I'm a dual citizen of both countries, of Germany and New Zealand.
To whom is this question?
To anyone that feels most.
Okay. Who would like to take it?
China expert?
China, I don't know. I think we can learn a lot from the Asia-Pacific region. That's for one. That's not necessarily what you were referring to. I mean, if we speak about cooperating with like-minded partners, then I think there's absolutely no reason to think and to include here Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, you name it. So I absolutely don't see that. I think what has always been the case and what will continue to be the case is that with those countries, we are in a relationship of partnership and competition. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. It has always been the case. What is sort of, if we think of sort of this triangle that the EU has formulated with regard to China, what distinguishes our like-minded partners from China is that there's no systemic rivalry with them. So, cooperation with other like-minded partners will always sort of, I guess, be bound by the existing competition as well. That are the boundaries, that are the limits. But in general, I think there's plenty to do with regional partners, and actually also, as I mentioned, to learn from regional partners because they are exposed 7, 10, 15 years ahead of us in sort of their exposure to also Chinese influence and Chinese interference into democratic societies. We've been mostly talking here about the economic angle, which is important, but of course there's also a question of resilience of our own democracies, and that also has an economic dimension, but it goes far beyond. And I think countries like Australia and others have made not unfortunate experiences, but quite concerning experience with the Chinese, and we need to be prepared that that's also going to come to Europe unless we are able to sort of build up our firewall, sort of equip ourselves. I think there's still time to do it, but we should start doing it now.
And maybe to add one thought on it, there's a trade agreement in ratification with Australia and New Zealand, and this will of course open up more opportunities for the European market. When we again think about the opportunities for businesses, it will secure supply chains between those regions, and also because in the beginning we were talking about raw material access, so this is also something. So in my opinion, companies should definitely look out to these trade agreements which are already in place or which are in ratification to aim at these countries, regions to set up their partnerships in such countries. So New Zealand is a good example.
And someone a free trade agreement with India.
To add up on that, Scholz being among them, but that will be an EU competence. So yes, I think reaching out in terms that have been mentioned to regional partners will be part of the solution.
Yeah, I think what this question shows is that it is not just this China, US, and Europe in the middle, and that's it. But there's much more countries and much more potential partners in the world, and another one would be the ASEAN community. So it all requires a lot of very good foreign policy making. Business leaders also need to be clever and strategic in their decisions, and it's by far not certain that this is all going to go in the right direction and secure us from Cold War becoming a hot war. But the good thing is that there is a lot that can be done and a lot of options to take. So I think enough reason to be optimistic.
I see a question here in the back, and then the gentleman in the front. Yeah.
My name is Niels. I have two questions to the whole panel. One is regarding the CHIPS Act, also the European CHIPS Act. We see, what's your comment on that? Is it more like only a French industrial policy driven by Commissioner Breton, or is it actually successful? I mean, we see investments, especially in Germany, but as you said already, we also can fear a subsidy race, also questions of competition. And maybe just one point, how successful do you see the Chinese policy at the moment? We can see there's a lot of money by the Chinese government, but actually not that much of investments by foreign companies in China, and we've seen also some policy changes by the Chinese government. I think there were some articles in January on how President Xi was actually quite unhappy with how it's going at the moment. And my second question is maybe regarding the Chinese or China strategy, which is at the moment written by the German government. What's the impact of that for German companies? What do you think about, will there be stress tests?
Which one do you mean?
Well, the one which is written.
That was part of the answer.
So we see a bigger role of politics regarding foreign policies, especially towards China, and also its impact for companies. Maybe just give us some outline what does it mean for companies in general in the future? Do they have to do stress tests? What's the impact for them?
Maybe if we start with the last question. I mean, we all are not aware where exactly the strategy currently sits. There has been, as far as I understand, there has been a competition within the Green Party, Ministry of Economy versus Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who produces the most sophisticated or the most meaningful China strategy. Both were in conflict with the Chancellor in his office, where they wanted to have a more collaborative strategy. From all that I have seen and heard, at the end there will be a positioning that we need to be less dependent on China, and this will lead to some requirements for businesses in terms of stress tests or diversification, or in an increased need for justification if you have very strong dependencies on China. How businesses will take it, I talked to people at BASF, and they said, you know what, when there is really this war between China and Taiwan, then our investment here is going to be the smallest problem that we're having, so we shouldn't be worrying about it. I mean, they will all take it differently. If there's legal requirements to do something, then they will do. It's good for us as a consulting firm because we can help. But I don't think that the German-China strategy is going to be the big game changer in this story.
Josef, I know you can't wait to answer.
I think the German-China strategy will be the US-China strategy, because we don't have another option. I mean, we don't have a military or don't have weapons. I'm always amazed when I listen to talk shows what we all should do. So we are completely dependent, and when the US says do this, we will do this. Also with Huawei, and here I'm less optimistic. I think Huawei in the IT sector, that's not only business, the next generation, the leapfrog, but also the next military application. So therefore, I think we will have big trouble when we are not getting out of Huawei. We will have to, because America will say, you get out, or you're on your own. You cannot depend on our protection. This will mean VW, BMW, and all the others will be hit very hard. So in a sense, we will pay a heavy price for not having an own strategy, for not having people who are capable of thinking strategies. We should have began that decades before that. Now it's all about a little feminism here, a little there, and this. It won't be adding up to a strategy. So we will do what pawns do. We try to be partners, but I think we are not sovereign, not as Germans, and I'm afraid also not as Europeans. So we will be junior partner, and we'll be paying a price. It's not like in the old Cold War, and that's a twist. In the old Cold War, we had business with America, we had protection from America. We didn't have to choose. Now, the thing is more complicated also for Australia and the whole global south. Yes, we depend on the United States of America more than we did before, but we want to have business here and there. We have different interests, and that's why I think we have a transatlantic illusion. If we think the old Cold War is a new pattern we could replicate, because this one will be paying a heavy price. And the last question, I don't give you the answer yet. You need an incentive to stay here for the afternoon, because that's what we do in the two panels, right?
Yeah. Okay, then the gentleman in front here.
I was just trying to pick up on the point.
Can you say your name?
Sorry. My name is Alex. I'm from Berlin Global Advisors, glad to be here. And my question was, basically, I would like to pick up on this point that there are other countries. So I was curious to hear if maybe one of the panelists could answer this or give his view on how could Africa and Central Asia be a part of a sort of a wall to release the pressure on supply chain, supply bottlenecks with rare earths. So is that like part of the discussions currently in the European Union or in the foreign policy establishments in Berlin? Because I only hear exactly again like US and China, but for example, we see a lot of serious projects in Africa coming from
So, thank you for your questions. I'll start quickly and then hand over. So, if you have a look at it's not set yet, but the draft of the German China strategy. Africa is mentioned as well, but only as a side note. And so when it comes to ideas by the German government about new partners, they at the moment, or at least in the China strategy, they are more focusing on the Indo-Pacific, for example, or also on Central and South America, now aiming at new trade agreements with Mercosur, Chile, Mexico, etc., especially in terms of lithium, for example. But Africa, at least in this strategy, only plays a side note.
I mean, some things are already happening, like Namibia has a huge project on producing green ammonia, and the German government is pushing this very, very strongly. Then there are several trade agreements under discussion or in the process of being signed. Our attitude towards trade agreements in the political debate has also changed, and I think because of priority setting, it's seen that different or we need to change a bit our political preference structure. There could be much more, and I think that's what I said in this quick answer at the end of the previous round. It's not that what the Chinese are doing is always a model of success, and they give the money for free, and then everybody is benefiting. And as far as I know, the whole the Chinese government is not very happy with the state of the Belt and Road Initiative. And a lot of the partner countries are much less happy even because they are heavily indebted and they don't really see the benefit from all that. So there is a lot of opportunity for offering European partnerships that can be more productive. And maybe the final word, rare earth. The big problem is when it comes to monopoly position of China is not so much the availability of rare earth, but more the processing and the refining capacities. And this is something this requires or this environmentally very challenging processes, and doing it in a setting like in a country like in Germany would be incredibly expensive and difficult. And maybe you will have to fight with people who don't really want to have it in their backyard. And then there are potential partner countries where you could find reasonable approaches. It doesn't mean to find a place where you can dump all the stuff and replace find another alternative to China. In that way, it always requires to make responsible decisions on values and principles that we have. But still, I mean, there are places in the world where you can do this more easily than in Germany. And so along these lines, the answer to your question should be, or the required action of policymakers.
Maybe two quick ones. Africa, we have been dozing for the last 20 years. That's where China is. Not even America gets in there. I mean, they are there not only with business and contracts, but also with military to safeguard all that. Latin America is America's backyard. Mike Pompeo, you may remember him. He could be one of the contenders. Spoke of the Monroe Doctrine, so Europeans get the heck out of there. So we may have to think again. This is trade agreements, that's the old world kumbaya, where the free market can do what he or she wanted, where we wanted to have more governments in there to regulate this and that. Now we have a lot more governments, and they push in powers. That's geoeconomics. So the Americans would say, this is geostrategic, this is security-wise, no business case. So we have come from this end to that end, and I think again, when you cannot compete, I mean, it's not the rule of law, it's not the WTO, it's might that will be right. And let's check our forces on this one. And I believe we live in a world where it's not the rule of law any longer. It's military might that will be right, and that can also be used for economic advantage, and that's the other side of the coin of geoeconomics. So we have to think both things together, the economics and hard power, that's geoeconomics.
There was a question, so Tim, would you?
No. Take one more question and then.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay. No. Then in the back. Sorry about it.
I lived last 25 years in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and I want to come back.
It's again a cost factor, of course, and this is also why we actually need partners in Western territories, or you named it, also South America, where we are now strengthening our partnerships, because at least by now it is still, still not efficient to do the whole litigation, for example, and the whole processing, and to use then the materials to do all that in Germany, and we don't have the capacities at the moment. So looking at the future, of course it should be a goal at least to strengthen our domestic production capacities, but we are not there yet.
I would say, exporting labor-intensive work to places where there is cheap labor is, I wouldn't say it's we export our problems and let them solve it, but it can create like a win-win situation. So it's in general, it's been the Washington consensus policy. I mean, it has been economically an incredibly successful period for the global economy, and it has helped to bring a lot of people out of poverty, where otherwise there would not be any alternative to do things. But I mean, in a lot of, also if you think of the German energy politics, we don't want to have shale gas. We don't want to produce shale gas in Germany, but we are importing shale gas from the US. That's just one example. There's many others. This is a difficult mindset, and what the current situation will force us is to make or to rethink these things. Like it used to be that people were against free trade agreements because they thought, like, well, some political arguments. It's like exploiting difficult situation of people in other parts in the world. A little bit like this, we export our problems in other regions, and now suddenly we see that there's also benefits from it, and we need to find a common ground and a basis for making a responsible decision. And I think in that way it's a positive incentive to come to a better constellation.
Yeah, maybe combining a couple of things that have been sort of floating around. I mean, for one, I can comment specifically on raw materials. Others are sort of better equipped, are more knowledgeable to do so. What I do think is that the current situation is also an opportunity for Europe to sort of understand that things don't necessarily go our way as we thought for such a long time. I might be slightly less optimistic or less enthusiastic about industrial policy than some of my fellow panelists here. If I look at the CHIPS Act, there has been a question on the CHIPS Act before. I think it's not unlikely that it will be a huge failure, precisely because things are being done that make headlines, but that not necessarily will actually turn out to be technological and economic successes. So I think, and Europe more than Germany, so Brussels more than Berlin, I think, is starting to sort of realize a couple of those challenges. I think that, for example, Africa is being thought of much more closely in Brussels than it is here in Berlin. That is to the question from the gentleman here in the front. So that there, I think it is an opportunity, but we are really only starting this process. But if you talk about China in Brussels, a lot that you hear is global gateway, so engagement with third countries. So I think Brussels has understood better than Berlin so far that yes, it will be partly about industrial policy, it will be partly about reshoring things here back to Europe, but it will a lot be about sort of rethinking how to better, deeper, and sort of more sustainably engage with the rest of the world. That includes regions like Africa, with all its difficulties. I'm not saying that we have the solutions, we know how to do it, but I think it will be really, it requires a strategy that is multifaceted, and industrial policy is one element of it, but really only one element of it. There was one thing I wanted to pick up, and that was the question sort of how successful is China currently. That sort of speaks a bit to China's innovativeness. Well, first of all, there's not little foreign investment in China. Last year was record high for German investments in China. Historic high, just to mention that. So it's not that our companies are not betting on staying in the Chinese market. What is interesting is it's more concentrated, so it's few large companies doing this. It's a lot also sort of adapting to the fact that we will probably sort of see a disentanglement of different supply chains. So it's strengthening resilience. Whether that is in our sort of interest or not, different question. But I don't see that Western companies are necessarily not betting on remaining in the Chinese market. On the innovativeness, I think yes. What is correct is that we don't necessarily can be sort of rest assured that China is not going to overcome obstacles that currently exist. But if you look at the innovation model that we have seen in the last 10, 15 years, then I'd say there's also challenges to that at the moment. Whether China is going to solve them or not is a different question, but China will need to find new solutions to face current challenges of its innovativeness. Goes probably it's now too far to sort of go into details at this stage, but challenges ahead, yes. Can we be sure China is not going to solve them? No, I think that's an open question.
Another question in the back, yes?
Nothing wrong being a junior partner if the bigger partner has the same interests and the same values. So you could pick on both and could ask yourself, what if Donald Trump is re-elected? Are we going to have the same values? Is America then still a democracy? All valid questions. I mean, we had a Republican here who is trying to prevent Donald Trump, and they do a lot. There's a lot of money pouring in, but he says the bets are off. So we don't know that. So our security could be in the hands of Donald Trump again. So think about that for a moment. The other thing, even if Biden is re-elected and he's energized again to run again, even Biden is re-elected, I mean, America won't have the same interest. I mean, we saw it was the CHIPS Act. That was an aggression not only to China, but also to Europe and to the Inflation Reduction Act. So we do not have the same interest. Therefore, we need a unit, and that's the United Europe. And to get there, we have to do first things first, and money is a thing. We had a finance minister. He's now happens to be chancellor now, and now he has to put the money where his mouth was. He was speaking about the Hamiltonian moment. I won't be too long. I mean, the Hamiltonian moment was when debt was communitized in the United States of the single states, and it became the United States of America. Civil war in between happened, so we should avoid that in Europe. We should learn from America's mistakes, but we have to get there. So get a common debt, make the euro, and that's the most important, a global currency, reserve currency. Same status as the dollar. So far, the dollar can be used as a weapon, and by weaponizing the dollar, America is undermining the dollar privilege. So some work is done by America itself, the other one needs to be done by us. And therefore, we need statesmen, not bean counters. I'm afraid we do have bean counters who think about the old strategies. Oh, we don't want to bail out the Southern Club and this and that. That's the old world. Opportunity cost is what is instead. If we don't achieve that, we won't have the United States of Europe, we will have single parts that can be divided and conquered either by China or Donald Trump's America.
Given our neighborship, security forces and abilities is also a very important answer to this question. We see in the current conflict that we actually are, as Europe, completely dependent on what the US is doing in military actions. We've seen this in Afghanistan as well. And this is something we cannot change quickly, but it is for sure that we need to change this. And this could also allow us for a bit of deeper cooperation again with the United Kingdom, for example, who in terms of military abilities are rather well equipped and established. And that's a direction that should also be taken much more seriously than it's done so far.
Well, I'm afraid I have to leave soon, so a very quick reply. I'm a bit struggling with sort of these catch-all phrases of Europe either being a junior partner or a third force in this triangle. I think neither is sort of the adequate description here. On Huawei, just to give that example, I mean, isn't it remarkable? So far, Germany has really not followed what the United States wants. So far. But we have increased Huawei's engagement in our critical infrastructure here, despite all the US pressure. That might change in the future. And on that one, I think it would be good to follow the United States, maybe not to the same extent, but our response to the Huawei discussion, I think, has certainly not been to our benefit. But I think we are neither nor. Be prepared that we will be sort of aligned with our transatlantic partners in the United States, but also be prepared that differences in perspective and in policy will remain. So I think we are neither sort of a third force. We will always closely aligned with the United States, but main reason has already been mentioned: security alliance, values, interests. There's at least some degree of convergence here, but security alliance, of course, sort of being the hard pillar of that. But I also don't see that Europe has sort of no freedom to act vis-a-vis the United States. Simply don't see it. I'm afraid I have to leave. I'm very sorry, but it was a great pleasure being with you today.
Thank you very much. Should we continue this one? Should we continue just to wrap it up? Maybe, Jennifer, do you want to make a final point, or?
Yeah, maybe just to add something that wasn't mentioned yet. So one thing in this whole discussion could also be how are we dealing with norms and standards, and how are we setting norms and standards? How are we driving these? Because this will also be a major issue in the power play, not only between the US and China, but also for Europe. And norms and standards are really very technical, very unsexy topic, but we shouldn't forget about having these things in mind, and because especially China is pushing forward, trying to set their own norms and standards globally, and we see that also international organizations like the International Organization of Standardization, they are having partners not only in the West, but also China is a partner, other countries are partners. And just to give them as an example, they are saying that actually they don't want to have to do anything with power rivalry. They see themselves only technically, but in my opinion, this is not actually how you can deal as businesses nowadays, because you really need to think about, do I want to be important with what I'm producing? And then we really need to set norms and standards as fast as we can to play a major role on global markets in the future.
And I think with this final statement, it's quite positive. So we end on a positive note, and we're going to divide everyone into the workshops. We have, first of all, I would like to thank everyone from the panel for this great and insightful discussion. Just a round of applause.